Morning, Kelly, and I wanted to start by touching briefly on individual players and the return to training, because it was reported last night by Matt Law at The Telegraph that N'Golo Kanté was granted compassionate leave to miss training yesterday. He did actually go back on Tuesday for the first day of Phase 1 training at Chelsea, but obviously seems to still have concerns about the restart. And I think it's important here to underline and explain to people that he does have some quite serious personal circumstances. His father passed away when he was very young. He lost his brother to a heart attack in 2018 and also had a health scare himself a couple of years ago. I do think it's important that we tell people that for context. You've also got the situation at Watford where obviously Adrian Mariappa is now self-isolating after testing positive. In addition, according to the Times, you've got Troy Deeney and as many as 5 further players who didn't report for Watford training yesterday. And so, Jamie, the point I wanted to put to you is it's not about blame or really about any of these individual players, because as we see with Conte, as we've seen with Troy Deeney, everyone has different circumstances. But what I wanted to ask is, at what stage does it become a problem for the restart if Watford have got 7 players that can't train, if Chelsea haven't got one of their best players? I don't know, I suppose to push it all the way, at what point can't we do this?
Well, some managers actually, Patrick, have come out and said, listen, whatever happens from now, it's going to be a fair situation, even if it is, teams not playing in their own stadiums. But if you're going to lose 3-4 players, Troy Deeney's the captain of Watford, that makes it not a fair competition. So I do think it's going to get harder and harder. I think you're going to see more and more players coming out saying they're not comfortable about playing, they don't feel confident about what's going on. So you just have to take each incident in isolation. It's so difficult for players right now. A lot of them want to come. A lot of players are really keen to get started, and I get that. But there's also players like N'Golo Kanté that will be nervous. He'll be looking at underlying health problems himself, from his family, and will believe if I come back into an environment and I was to give the virus to somebody, how would he feel about that going forward? So it's incredibly difficult. And if he doesn't want to play, I think Frank Lampard would be the first to say that's absolutely fine. And he will then turn to players that do want to play. But there'll be a lot of footballers right now that are nervous to say that I'm not comfortable about it because they worry about the repercussions. Maybe people saying, well, you should play, you should be out there, you're earning this much money. Players have to be comfortable about this. That's the first thing about it. Of course, safety is paramount right now. But I do get it. It's such a difficult, unprecedented situation for players. I always try to put myself in their shoes. What would I do? Now, I suppose in my era, I would have just done as I was told. I'm sure Gary was the same. We'd have just, manager says, turn up for training and do it. I think players now have more of an understanding. They've probably got more of a voice. They have agents that can also help them in this situation so they don't feel necessarily they can't speak out. So I think it is a lot more, it's a lot easier for players right now in a situation like this to come forward and say, look, I don't feel right about this. So in a way, that does really help.
Jamie, do you think there's a lot more players than we're hearing about? There's just the odd name at the moment. Are there a lot more players that are uncomfortable than we know about?
Absolutely. I've spoken to managers and there's a lot more to come out that just don't feel right about it. And that's going to be a major problem, because if you have a situation where you've got a squad of 22, 23 players and 6, 7 of them are not comfortable, they feel they're putting their families at risk. How is that then a fair competition? It really does become difficult for coaches and everybody. It becomes a real Premier League problem because it's not fair anymore. It doesn't become fair if you're losing 5 or 6 of your best players. So I do think it's a really hard one. Now, hopefully we don't get to that situation and players feel really confident about it, and they look and when they go to training, they do realise the lengths that are going to keep everybody safe. And then obviously they'll feel more comfortable. But as I say, it's incredibly difficult. And I know the numbers were mentioned. There was how many players tested positive the other day, 5 or 6. I was actually surprised at that. I didn't think there'd be any. I was amazed that because we are self-isolating, because we haven't been in an environment to catch it, I thought we were going to be maybe have 1 max. So the fact that we had that many really, really did surprise me.
Gary, how much of a problem do you see it as being for the league in a broader sense?
I think Jamie's covered it pretty well there. There's not much to add to it other than to say that I think that players are uncomfortable. The dressing room is it's a challenging environment to stand up and say, I'm not going to come into training. I'm not going to be with the rest of my teammates. I think Jamie's right. 20 years ago, I think everybody would have been basically pressurised and told to get on with it. And you would have felt that peer pressure, but that peer pressure still exists. And that sort of, it's almost like when your manager used to say to you when you were younger, training's optional tomorrow. Don't worry if you don't want to come in. I won't hold it against you. You knew full well that you had to come in because you felt that if you didn't come in, you weren't being professional. And it's a little bit like that now when you hear a manager on television say, I won't put any pressure on my players. The rest of the players are in here. If one doesn't want to come in, I won't make him come in. But you imagine if you're a player at home with doubts and all the rest of your teammates are going in, you're going to go in. So I do think that Jamie's covered it pretty well. I think that Kante, you've mentioned his circumstances. You can understand why he's nervous. Troy Deeney, obviously, last week the same. And I do think there'll be more players in training at the moment that have got nerves that will be probably just a bit wary about coming out and say, I don't want to come in. I don't want to fight for these last few weeks of the season. It's more important that I consider my health. But then the large majority of players will be okay with it and will want to play. So I think it's a case of we're not going to stop this now. The players are back in training. This is a train that's on the track. It's not going to stop.